starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Note how incredibly just unethical we find institutions like SeaWorld and the way we treat animals now map those similar forms of training to the military, where these animals' lives will be put at risk. That is going to just be immensely more unethical than something that is commonly considered in society as clearly coercive and harmful to these animals. That reason we should clearly oppose this mission. There's a little bit of setup on what types of voles these dolphins and sea lions will be doing. Just consider what was mentioned in the info slide. They need great darkness eyesight. They need the ability to detect different metals. There's probably going to be overwhelming things like underwater mine detection and underwater submarine detection. But that's all the stuff they need. So 2 points of substantive in this speech. Firstly, just why is this an incredible violation of animal rights? A few things to say here. Firstly, just why is this program in and of itself extremely immoral? We're going to examine this program at 3 different stages of the program. Firstly, let's consider the training stage of these programs. So firstly, the training requires these animals to go through training and conditioning that just completely goes against their natural instincts. For example, instead of when in nature they would probably swim away from a lot of these mines and dangerous elements, now they are incentivized to and conditioned to now swim towards these immensely dangerous elements, these immensely dangerous mines. But also, so that the act of detecting just goes against their natural instinct in the first place, and that means they're conditioned to just go against their nature. But also, the way that conditioning operates, it can just be analogized out to the way training is done in places like SeaWorld. Conditioning can just be extremely bad. They could be taken away from their pod mates, they could be taken away, they could not be given the adequate amount of food that they likely need to help condition them. This is of course immensely ethically harmful to these dolphins. Let's consider beyond the training stage, and let's consider the deployment stage of these dolphins. So as I flagged in setup, these dolphins are going to primarily do things like mine detection. And note importantly, these are things that probably can't be done by other things like there's protections around detecting these bombs or submarines from other things. So dolphins will probably, and sea lions will probably be overwhelmingly deployed in areas like these. First thing we want to note here is that even if none of these dolphins and sea lions face any harm, being endangered if and of itself is an immense moral danger, an immense moral harm for these dolphins. I guess by way of analogy, it's like if you dangle your dog out a 10-story window and then bring the dog back in, you have not harmed the dog in any physical way, but the risk of that dog being harmed is probably something that dog should never have to face in the first place. Similarly, the fact that dolphins, even if nothing should happen to these dolphins and sea lions, the fact that they are at risk of such an immense harm is a massive ethical harm. But then also there's a condition where something terrible does just happen to these dolphins, and that means they literally just die an immensely painful death. And that, in and of itself, we just should not support dolphins dying an immensely painful death, and sea lions dying an immensely painful death. But even if they're doing more benign roles, these animals then become security risks to other nations at the point where they're doing things that help the goals of the US military. So now they will become the targets of other nations, and because dolphins and sea lions cannot be kept as captives or things like that, you cannot interrogate dolphins or sea lions, what these other nations are going to do is they're probably most likely going to kill these dolphins and sea lions. They're going to become an immense risk of foreign powers, of violence from foreign powers. So even if they're not doing things like mine detection, like they may want to push, they're still at an incredible risk in these waters, and that is something we should not stand by. But then it's also important to consider, what do you do when these animals are old and at retirement age? And we first just want to note, there's a very large incentive for the US military to just turn them into suicide bombs. A few reasons for this. It's probably just far cheaper than other forms of medical euthanasia, or giving them, or sending them to other places. And also it's just operationally useful for the US military. And note at the point where it's probably, note at the point where they're probably just treated like assets by the military. They probably want to get the most out of this asset as they can. And as such, they can, and if they can operate in operational useful ways, like steering around complex coral structures to reach their target, that is something that the US military will at least consider doing to these dolphins. And note that is just clearly an immensely unethical harm. That is something we should never support. But I will be more generous here, and let's say, what if dolphins do not become suicide bombers? They probably just don't live very good lives out of that. I think the first thing to note is, as I mentioned in the training stage, these dolphins have been trained out of their natural instincts. They probably cannot be sent back out into the wild because they now don't have those self-preservation instincts. So they'll either be sent to other corrupt and coercive places like SeaWorld, or they'll just be medically euthanized and so die anyway. And note the clear impacts here. First, you just expose these dolphins and sea lions to a massive amount of harm that they would not face in the comparative. These creatures are not endangered creatures, and in the status quo, they probably will not face these immense harms that they will be faced on to a military. So just the net harm to these animals increases insanely. But also the existence of this program has compounding effects, because now other countries will want to jump on, will probably match the operational advantage that the US now has if these dolphins and sea lions are effective. So they will probably want to go and use these animals in their own military endeavors, just increasing that harm so much more. Now, Neg may come up and say that other humans may just be performing these similarly dangerous roles in the status quo. I think a few things to say here. Firstly, the way in which we win a war just does, in fact, matter. Firstly, it just sets precedents for how wars are fought in the future. And yes, while it's probably also unethical for humans to have to fight and die in these wars, we shouldn't increase that level of unethicalness to the involvement of innocent and non-consenting animals, and that is in and of itself immoral. But also, it's just comparatively less immoral to use humans in these instances. They just can, at least more than dolphins and sea lions, consent. They have danger tolerances where they can just be like to their commanders, I don't feel safe here, I want to get out. Dolphins and sea lions cannot communicate that. On the secondary substantive, really quickly, on why the military is just no good at all. Firstly, there's a massive opportunity cost in doing this program. They're using this money for dolphins. You can just use this money to help poor people and things like that. And note they could say this is money that's specifically attributed to the military, but the military budget is established bilaterally, which means the military goes and proposes what projects they need funding for. At the point where you cut out the money now needed for a dolphin and sea lion research project, now that money can just be distributed to more socially utile ways. So it's just quite a massive opportunity cost here. But also, the military is just used to perpetuate global inequality. So just consider how the US Navy controls waters around South America. Yes, dolphins weren't used in the economic oppression of places like Venezuela or Cuba. But now you just add on to that oppression where you add another vector, which the US can use to break the ways in which these countries used to defend themselves, to further aggravate these countries. That is just a massive harm. We protect dolphins. We protect sovereignty of nations. So happy to.
Awesome, thank you so much for that speech, and I welcome the first speaker of the negative team.
I'd like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Playing with the ball contradicts with the instinct of dolphins or dogs, but obviously they enjoy it. Reading books is not in humans' instinct, but it's morally good for them to read it. We think that just swimming in the ocean and just detecting it, and if you detect, go back to the Navy. I think it's not a morally, immoral thing, and we think that it's totally permissible. So we win by proving 4 things. First is that it's an acceptable way of instrumentalizing animals. Second, why animals are used in a good way. And third, why it's better than no animals alternatives. And lastly, even if we admit that animals are as important as humans in a human's moral sense, why it's also good for animals. So first, why it's an acceptable way of instrumentalizing animals. Recognize that all animals use other animals all the time. It's not limited to humans. First reason here is that the necessity. For the average reasonable person, eating meat is morally acceptable. That's the intuition of a lot of people here. Why? Because it's necessity. In order to take nutrition, for example, but also the animals, they feel pain, but they have level of intelligence maybe, but it's not the same as the level of humans, right? We think that the outcome or goal of this program is far greater than the goal of eating meat, which is to keep the diet. Which means that the necessity of this program, I'll explain it later, is far more greater than eating meat, which average reasonable person admit it as a morally permissible. The second reason here is that the extent of harm. We think that it's more it's far more harmful for animals to eat them, but we think that it's morally good to just train them and they swim on the sea and they came back if you detect something. We think that the extent of harm is far less than compared to other things that we admit as morally permissible. And no, we are happy to trade off one sea lion, for example, even if, to one ship or submarine, which will do the alternative, which contain many people inside, and we think that it's morally permissible, not to do such alternative. But second thing, why animals are used in a relatively good way here. The first reason here is that the priority of Navy are distinctive from other branches of military. So we have no BOP to protect, Air Force bombing. Maybe we can say it's morally bad, but we think that Navy is engaging, and also they are likely to use those sea animals into 2 programs. First is that the security support in the Pacific Ocean, for example, the protecting Solomon Islands, or we are talking about near Malaysia Sea or Japan, in order to to detect any the dangerous the things that the other states or other the organizations are trying to do. Maybe we can protect the Taiwan Strait, for example. But the second program here is that the securing shipping, for example, from protecting from the the piracy activity, for example. We think those are the main things that the Navy is currently doing, and also they are the programs that those Navy is likely to use animals for. Which means that the worst interventions of U.S. military that we can see now are not the navies. We can see how ground forces commit war crime, or how air forces are bombing civilians. But we think that it's distinctive from the Navy's programs. Why? Because there's almost no civilians on the ocean, right? It's impossible for them to commit the war crime, for example, in the sea, very rare. Which means that the activity of Navy is morally good. They have no mechanism why Navy is more likely to commit such the morally bad things. And we think that this program is why positive. We think that not only it's morally permissible, but it's also very positive. The analogy here is that the dogs are working for airports to detect drugs. Obviously, it's morally good to protect people from the trade of illegal drugs internationally. We think that it's morally good to protect those vulnerable people than protecting just one dog, which are actually treated quite well. So affirmative tried to say that the suicide bombers will be born, but I think that it's just unlikely. What if they come back with bombs as they are trained? So we think that's unlikely. But third thing that I was playing here is that it's much better than the other alternatives that don't use animals for 3 reasons. First is that this program is more affordable compared to the cost of the hundreds of millions of dollars for submarines or shippings to create, compared to the cost of training just sea lions. We think that it's the significant difference of cost. Cost saving means that the government can use them to pay for vulnerable workers or use for other social welfare in the country, for example. We think the saving cost is also good. So B is that the better for Navy personnel. Now people are, engaging in stressful and mentally burdensome jobs. But, interaction with the sea lions or interaction with sea animals is actually mentally relieving for those people, meaning that like being alone in the ship for a long time is morally bad compared to, having interaction with the sea lions. But C is that it's a safer means. The premise here is that the sea lions or sea animals who are trained are undistinguishable from other sea lions or other like the submarines, right? Because they don't really need any like the machines to detach. They are just trained to detect something and they come back, which means that they are unlikely to develop a significant tension between other states. Even if other states think that maybe those like sea lions coming into their ocean might be the agents of the US military, for example, they are unlikely to understand it as the signal of the increasing tension or signal of like attack coming from the US military. I think that's why they are unlikely to take it, develop it as the significant tension between the country, which leads to the very significant risk of conflict in the nation. And I also think that there are so many sea animals, and it's unlikely that those like the military will try to kill those sea lions, considering that the cost of killing those animals is very, very significant. But also, I will note that just like the other countries, having information is actually good. Meaning that uncertainty is far worse, because if countries are not having information of other states, they will develop the uncertainty, which basically develops the security dilemma, right? You don't know whether the military is having information or is planning something. But if you have so many information about the other states' oceans, for example, you are unlikely to take any small action as the trigger of the conflict or trigger of war. Meaning that alternative drones or detection sensors are more likely to be seen as the trigger of these tensions. We think it's more bad. But fourthly, why it's even better for animals? A, they are more likely to survive because one, there are have more nutritious food. Second, they're less likely to have predators. But third, they will likely to get medical care if they are injured or if they have certain mental health, for example. But B is that animals love doing tasks. For example, dolphins apparently they enjoy playing with the ball, for example, in the aquarium, for example. Meaning that having such activities that the sea animals can do is actually enjoyable for those animals. Meaning for those two reasons, even if we admit that the animals are as important as humans a human's moral sense, we think that we still win the debate, and that's why I'm very proud to oppose.
Great, thank you so much for that speaker for their speech, and I now welcome the second speaker of the affirmative team.
Let's be clear about what war looks like. Because this is not an analogous situation to a dolphin going into a sea park and starting to play with a ball. No. Going to war is a very bad thing. It causes significant amounts of trauma, right? And I won't go into the depths of what that looks like. But it's lots of visceral imagery. It is often isolation from other people. It is often seeing brethren of different dolphins go through significant amounts of pain, potentially themselves going through significant amounts of pain. necessarily being forced to be going on specifically long deployments, necessarily, probably, and this gets necessarily probably worse when you are a dolphin rather than a human for a few reasons. One, and necessarily to create a sufficient army of dolphins that you can use, you necessarily need to breed dolphins. Those conditions are probably going to be particularly bad, particularly pervasive, because it is something that you cannot consent to. It is a position where lots of dolphins will probably be forced to give birth to other dolphins, necessarily put in quite small enclosures, and that in itself is a moral harm. We note, also, as we told you at first affirmative, this is a case where dolphins are unable to consent to these harms, and notably, going up to a ball and maybe like pushing it up, which I'm not actually sure like is something that dolphins enjoy in the first place, as the opposition wants to claim, is very, very different to going up to a mine and being next to that mine and necessarily wanting to play with it. These conditions that are unnatural for these dolphins are really harmful for them and is something that you ought to weigh incredibly highly inside this debate. Okay, two things that I'm going to do in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about why like the opposition's like responses to specific like moral hazards are probably insufficient. And secondly, on like the idea that it's probably like a better, more affordable version than what you get outside of this in the military. Okay, first on some miscellaneous responses. Opposition claimed that it is okay to do this and like morally permissible because we like often in the animal kingdom you see different animals using different animals for different things, and they made an analogy here to like eating meat being okay. First few things to note: we just don't necessarily agree that the like average reasonable person does believe that eating meat is something that's necessarily okay, right? Like it is something that, insofar as you see the moral harms that are like necessarily like seen with this of like putting these these animals in extreme captivity, causing them significant harm, is something that a lot of people don't necessarily think is morally permissible. But regardless of that, we just don't think this is necessarily like analogous, because A, yes, it is necessarily premised on this being a necessity for them to do. Necessarily, there are other options. You don't necessarily have to use these dolphins to be doing this. You can choose to not undergo these kind of like dangerous operations, especially ones that, as I will characterize later in this speech, are probably likely to be quite offensive. Okay, next thing to note is that and then this goes on to like the second thing that I wanted to deal with in this speech, which was about like what this actually looks like in terms of military use. So the opposition wanted to claim that it looks like things like stopping piracy. Well, okay, let's be clear about what these dolphins actually necessarily can do. Because what it looks like is a dolphin being able to distinguish between different metals, between like using echolocation to find things necessarily in the sea. You know what that is necessarily the perfect strong suit and type and use for? It is for detecting mines, right? It is something that that is probably significantly more if we believe that they are going to be used for something, it is probably one of the most cost-effective ways that they could use this dolphin to do this. Necessarily, this is probably a bad thing, right? Because when you what this looks like is you've got the dolphin going up to the mine, hopping up to the top. Opposition claims that dolphins are specifically good at doing this kind of thing because they're indistinguishable from other dolphins and therefore are less likely to be shot down. But we think that the more believable mechanism is that if you are inside the waters and the widespread use of dolphins or sea otters starts working here, then probably what happens is just a large proportion of dolphins get shot down in this area to stop you from being able to do this kind of stuff. And necessarily, it is really bad if you stop them from, if you now have an offensive tool for using these different mammals to try and stop the detection of mines inside of the sea, because that means that you probably are more able to perform significant offensive operations, which is probably a bad thing, right? It probably just means that the US Navy has this new tool to be able to do significantly harmful things in terms of blockading South American trade, all that kind of stuff. And what we tell you also specifically is that as soon as the US Navy starts using these kind of otters and like dolphins, it is incredibly likely that other kinds of countries will follow from this. That is because they have an incentive to try and get some military headway. And insofar as they had any moral thoughts about, oh, maybe we shouldn't use dolphins as like suicide bombs or whatever. Now, since the US military has done it, it is something that they probably ought to do in order to be like commensurate and maintain that competitive edge with the US military. That probably means the widespread use of these dolphins to do things that are probably like offensive kind of operations, notably trying to destroy mines so that the countries that are trying to defend their shores and defend their waters necessarily have like the ability, like the offensive countries necessarily have a greater ability to send ships and submarines and those kind of things in between this. Okay, next thing that the opposition wants to claim is just like, the alternative is you probably just like kill one sea lion to like make sure that you don't sink a submarine. Few responses to this. A, it is unclear why it is true that you necessarily like want to conduct these operations if you're going to get such significant losses from this in the first place, right? Because if you are conducting an operation in which you could use a sea lion to do this, as opposed to sparing a submarine, it feels like now, if you don't have the option of using a lion or an otter, you probably don't necessarily conduct that operation in the first place. But even if you did believe that they do conduct those operations, and that wasn't necessarily something that happened, it also necessarily disincentivizes you from like researching into different bomb detection potentials inside of the US military, right? And that was because, insofar as you needed a bomb diffusing robot or a mine diffusing robot inside the waters, now there exists a dolphin which is doing a perfectly good job out there in the water who is diffusing your mine, and that becomes something that it is not necessarily for you to sort of research into. So, because you necessarily got you reduced this funding, we probably didn't see that this was the necessary alternative. But even if you didn't believe that the stuff about researching different bombs to increase this ability, we still believe that there probably does exist alternatives that aren't just levels of high human destruction. And we believe that insofar as there was some human destruction because of the lack of use of these things, that was somewhat more permissible because armies and places were unlikely to send you into necessarily as much into places where there would be high human death. These soldiers could necessarily consent to this. These soldiers had the ability to go home. That was something that was significantly less morally harmful than the dolphins who were treated so harmfully, and that's why I'm so proud to.
Great, thank you so much for that speech, and I now welcome second negative.
Awesome, are we all good? Look, if we abuse a few dolphins to make sure that fishermen in the Solomon Islands stop dying to mines when their boats go near them, I'm perfectly happy to trade that off. I think that this team hangs their hat on animal rights, a clash that they do not even win, and one that they do not substantiate why we all care about it higher. Therefore, I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how we all weigh animal interests compared to human interests. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why we comprehensively benefit humans. Finally, I'm going to talk about why I think we win on animal rights as well. Firstly, on how you ought weigh these two groups. I think you ought weigh humans significantly higher. This is because humans are smarter. They have consciousness. They have the ability to be emotional and to feel emotional pain, to rationalize, to do all of those kind of things that we do not know that animals are capable of doing to the same extent. We feel pain more acutely. We are connected to societies in these ways, and that means that when a fisherman dies from a mine, that has ramifications on the children who they're meant to feed with those boats, that has ramifications on their societies and their communities. So as well, I think the harms are likely to be much further dispersed among humans than in a pod of dolphins where it is unclear. Sure, there's probably some level of grievance, but I would not claim that it is nearly as acute to humans who throw massive ceremonies about these kind of things, who clearly grieve very, very clearly against these harms. But I think that again, this is just a principle that we see absolutely everywhere, that the average reasonable person probably just does believe intuitively that humans are more important. On vegetarianism, they say the average reasonable person probably is vegetarian or thinks it's right. 1% of Australia maximally is vegetarian. Most people are not vegetarian. They do not give a shit about the animals that are dying in significantly worse conditions than these dolphins would be in. And particularly, note that this is not a necessity. You can get things like iron from other sources. You can get it elsewhere. It is cheap and it is convenient. I think that compare this to things like mine, diffusing operations, like potentially saving people when they fall off of ships, like potentially doing things like detecting pirate ships in common trade areas. These are all obviously much more necessary and important. And that means that I think this is more comparable to things like training guide dogs, like things like training drug detection dogs, where again, the impact on animals is significantly lower than in the meat industry, which again, the average reasonable person probably thinks is relatively okay to some level for people to opt into, for people to buy from, for people to have that option. But particularly when we tell you these animals are probably going to be treated likely better, the implications are likely to be much higher. Weigh all of this against their one singular reason that we should value animals more, which is consent. They say that humans do not have the ability to consent. I would suggest that humans that are impacted by these operations not happening do not consent by being blown up by that mine when they went out to catch their fish, when they went out when they were seeking refuge, going between two nations or another, or something like that. But it is also just unclear why we weigh this higher than the utile impact that this has on the individuals that are affected. I don't think consent is particularly important in this instance. I also think that a lot of these animals probably would opt into and consent to this if we were able to communicate or talk to them. I'll talk about that in animal rights. Why then do we win so comprehensively on humans? Let me first address their few reasons. Basically, they say this is a waste of money. It should instead go to other things. Firstly, this is incredibly little money. This is some dolphins, some fish, some trainers. In the grand scheme of what the military sends, that is a drop in the ocean. That is literally nothing. But again, I think it is probably just likely to go to worse. We substantiate this at second. When you need other ways to do things like defuse mines, when you have to invest this money in military, arms manufacturing companies that do things like lobby governments to engage in wars and conflicts because that is profitable for them, obviously that money is going to a far worse place. I would rather it is spent on training dolphins and on providing them fish and support in that way. And the second claim here is that the military is just generally bad. And again, they don't substantiate this. That pretty much single example is mine detection, which I would say is an incredibly good thing to be doing. They're maybe the dolphins will blockade South American trade. How are the dolphins doing this? But also why, if the incentive exists for the US to blockade South American trade, would they not find a way to do this in other more pernicious ways that we described at first, ways that do lead to investment in, in these arms companies, that do lead to things that appear much more aggressive, much more military, which means you're much more likely to get the kind of spark, clashes that we explained at first that are likely to start things like conflicts, that are likely to be much more destructive. And that's what we explain, that these dolphins have, and the sea lions, or sea otters as they came out at second, have a massive capacity to have a positive impact, that they are a way to support Pacific nations, that they are a way to stop things like, to detect, ships on trade routes, to get rid of mines in really critical areas of the ocean, to rescue people in the ocean. That is very, very, very clearly debate winning, even if we killed so many dolphins to get it, because the impact is so high, because the impact is so beneficial on the communities and the people that we save in those regions. Okay, on animal rights though, because this is the team affirmative's only pathway to victory. And I think we just win this because of how uncomparative they are. I'll go through their arguments in a second, but where else would these animals be if they were not in this environment? We explained at first this would either be in the wild. I would suggest that this is a much worse, a much brutal life. This is one of being having predators hunt you down, hunt your pod members down. This is constantly being scared of things like food efficiency. In a world where climate change is happening, that is struggling to, with ocean acidification levels and stuff like that, being left out of the habitats you're currently in. That looks like being caught in the massive trawlers that are catching fish in the ocean. That is a horrible, horrible ways to exist. We think these animals would prefer on the outside of the house to be in captivity, where we think dolphins do form really close bonds with the people who train them, where they are quite playful, where they do enjoy things like tasks, where they have, I often describe it as the dogs of the oceans because they are in many ways friendly to humans in that sense. They love to play, they love to engage. The other alternative though, I guess, or of three, is that these animals would be, at places like SeaWorld, which this team concedes is significantly worse. But the final one, and this is again what they point to at second, is they say, we're going to have to breed these animals. I think again, it is far better for these animals to be alive, to have the opportunity at life and a community, to be able to enjoy things like swimming in the ocean, which I imagine must be incredibly fun as a dolphin. All of the joys that you give these animals when they live is better than to never have existed at all. And I think it is quite audacious of this team to say that this life is one that is going to be so much worse, that they ought not to have existed. I think that we give them that. They say, this animal breeding is likely to be unconsensual. Are they against all forms of animal breeding? We breed dogs for pets and all kinds of other things. Obviously, this is not a reason against animal breeding. I think that is again incredibly compelling. And that means that I think that again, even if you buy a lot of their content about why these programs are likely to be a bit less optimal than normal, they don't compare it to anything. They don't compare it to where these animals would be otherwise. I think it is an improvement. I think we win there. Let's go through the arguments though. Firstly, on training. They say this goes against their natural instincts. I think we deal with this first. Unclear why this is bad. Drug dogs probably don't want to go towards drugs. Humans at school probably don't want to breed. It goes against their natural interests. I don't think this is a particularly compelling claim. Then they tell us that they're likely to be treated badly. Again, I think the incentive is for these animals to be treated very well, and that is because the military obviously wants healthy and happy and functioning animals to be able to swim halfway across the ocean and detect mines. Compare this to SeaWorld, which has a clear profit incentive. Comparatively, the army probably has enough money to do things like feed these animals really well, so they're unlikely to cut the kind of corners that lead to mistreatment in these instances. But I think there is also probably some sort of incentive both for the individuals who are training these animals, who probably do form connections with them and probably do want them to be happy, but also with the army just not wanting to have a reputation of being dolphin killers and stuff like that mean that they probably don't treat them, at least in the very worst atrocious ways. Secondly, they talk about how we put these animals in danger in the method of employment. They are not in danger. Mines do not go off when a dolphin swims past them, otherwise that would be a big issue, right? Because dolphins constantly swim past them in the ocean. These go off when they detect things like metal that are on boats. That is what happens. These dolphins are in very, very little danger at all. But additionally, I think we're just putting them in the habitat where they would otherwise be. Otherwise they're swimming through these same oceans. There is no change. They would otherwise have these dolphins in these oceans swimming past all of these mines. But it's not like we're putting them in any more danger by doing that. It's not like hanging a dog out the window. It's like walking a dog down the street where they may equally get hit by a dog, whether or not you were walking them on the leash or not, right? Their final thing to say, they've got two more things. They say you'll be targeted by other nations. I think this is unlikely. These are used non-threateningly in things like clearing out mines, which generally have multilateral interests and incentives. But additionally, you don't know how it is an American dolphin versus a regular dolphin. You probably don't want to kill all the dolphins in the vicinity of your country. It just seems somewhat implausible that you would waste resources on that when the dolphins are just clearing out mines and rescuing people. I don't think that exists. On the suicide bomb stuff, we explained first you would just use a missile instead. You'd probably get massive backlash for strapping dolphins to bombs and sending them out into the ocean. Again, it seems implausible. Because we massively benefit humans, because we benefit the animals as well, so happy to propose.
Cool. Thank you so much for that speech. And I now welcome third affirmative.
What this negative team misses is the difference between something being widely practiced by society and something being immoral. Because contrary to what they say, even if most people are not vegetarians, I would put it to you that the vast majority of people probably do actually agree that eating meat is immoral. It is very difficult to get past the moral intuition that these are animals who live and breathe and feel pain and exist in communities much in the same way that humans do, and to think that somewhat morally acceptable, especially as they identify in cases without necessity. The difference is that because this is something we see as socially acceptable, people are willing to do it. But that does not make it moral. Those harms still accrue to those animals. Those animals still experience all the painful sensations they wanted to talk about. And we were the team that was not willing to accept that. two issues in the speech. Let's start by looking at the issue of animal rights. We're going to begin this by looking at whether or not the animals are actually materially being mistreated in this debate, because they make a few claims about why this is possibly a really good life for the animals. The first thing they say is that, well, maybe the animals get better food in this world, but we would suggest to you that in the wild, they probably are fed enough for the very intuitive reason that this is not an endangered species. So there probably is an adequate amount of food supply. The second observation is that they probably have a large variety in their diet, out in the open waters where they can choose to eat what they like. Whereas as part of the military, they probably get fed like a fairly routine diet, which sure, maybe sustains them, but probably does not allow them a lot of joy. And the third thing is the process of hunting for their food is probably in and of itself an enjoyable experience for that dolphin or sea lion, which is something they obviously never get on their side of the house. The second claim they make is, well, there are no predators insofar as you are controlled by the military. But obviously, the first thing we would identify is that dolphins and sea lions often do not have many predators anyways, for the reason that they can typically outswim sharks, they move really quickly, they travel in pods which can defend themselves. But additionally, even were predators to exist, this is obviously an incidental harm that occurs when these two animals swim near each other. Whereas under their world, you're deliberately sending the dolphins towards the mine, so I feel like that accrues a far greater degree of harm under their side. The final claim is that maybe this is good for their mental health insofar as dolphins enjoy playing with and doing tasks. The first thing we would say is that obviously this is not analogous to the acts a military would require you to do, which engage in far more danger. So we would suggest even if this was highly enjoyable, that would still be a bad thing. But the second commentary is, if it's true that dolphins enjoy playing with balls, seems bad to send them in to try and defuse mines which are vaguely ball-shaped. That seems deeply problematic and likely to accrue a huge host of animal welfare harms. So we also explain to you a few reasons why this is probably something which is really bad for these animals. The first we tell you is just the nature of the work. It's probably incredibly dangerous. It probably does involve them swimming past depth charges calibrated to target, living, breathing, vaguely human-sized animals, for example, such as individuals who engage in snorkeling for military installation and all that sort of thing. But the second thing we explain to you is that over the long term, this is a harm that is unlikely to go away. For the reason that the existence of this interim strategy probably means there is far less incentive to do research into human-less and animal-less methods of mine detection, which means that their world is the one where these dolphins are being harmed for much longer than strictly necessary. So that was something which was particularly bad. Let's look then at the idea of whether or not it was morally just to engage in, the instrumentalization of animals. They make three claims here. The first, that it is okay in cases where it is necessary, but obviously this is contingent on necessity, and we would suggest to you, firstly, that this is obviously not necessary for the United States writ large, as they themselves seem to concede. These are typically used in foreign interventions where the United States is not acting in any particular form of self-defense. The second observation we would make here is that even to the extent that it is necessary, this process engages in a fundamental form of cruelty against these animals insofar as you place them within these positions in a way that you probably ought actually never tolerate, for the reason that they themselves for the reason that there were certain moral boundaries which we thought it was simply unacceptable to expose these animals to. Analogously, for example, if you had a dog and you sold that dog to the military under the understanding that dog was going to engage in bomb testing and had very real chances of running into a mine, we would suggest to you that probably would be something which is comparatively unethical, for the reason that you are actively engaging that animal services in and putting them in danger in that instance, even in cases where there might be a positive eventuality at the end. But their second claim is that perhaps it is the case that these animals do not necessarily experience pain to the same extent as humans. And this seems to be, the vast bulk of their rhetoric about why animals don't matter as much. The first thing we would identify is a lot of the facts they tell you are just factually incorrect. Dolphins are incredibly intelligent, have been shown to be able to do things like maths, to do things like, engage in communication with one another in incredibly complex ways through the frequencies of their calls. They claim that dolphins don't have individuality, but we would suggest that they do probably have their own individual lived experiences. They do have their own personal senses of identity, much in the same way that most individuals do. The final claim they make is that maybe they don't have a community, but obviously each individual dolphin probably does build significantly strong communitarian bonds. The final bit of analysis I just want to give here, though, is that the idea that it is unknowable whether or not these dolphins experience those concepts is not in and of itself a reason to discount the possibility of them experiencing those attributes altogether. We should probably instead err on the side of caution in considerations around morality and believe that where it is potentially possible that those dolphins could live really meaningful, lived, enriched experiences, we probably ought not sacrifice them upon this altar. That broadly seemed unacceptable. Their team stands behind the saving of humans in compensation, but we think that this is relatively unlikely for a set of reasons. The first thing, as we explained to you down the bench, is that in cases where humans believe there to be significant amounts of danger, they can simply just pull out of the operation, and that is uniquely something these dolphins and animals were never capable of doing. It seems like, under our side at least, people at least have a far better sense of what they're getting into. They say humans don't consent to being blown up by the mines. Yes, this is obviously true, but the way people adapt to this solution isn't just to send the boat willy-nilly through the minefield. It's probably just to find an alternative route that, yes, perhaps takes a bit longer, but we think that is a sacrifice which is worth it for the sake of these animals. The next claim is the idea that, well, maybe it is the case that there are a set of important political interests where these dolphins are really important in controlling the area and activating defense systems. The observation we would make here, though, is that these dolphins are necessarily offensive weapons for the simple reason that the sorts of technologies we're talking about, like mines and depth charges, are necessarily defensive. That is, you as the home nation install them and you know the location of those devices, so you control your own boats to avoid those regions, whereas invading or threatening nations do not know the location and therefore are deterred. We would suggest to you if what their team cares about is the sovereignty of these regions and the ability of these regions to control their own waters, the introduction of the dolphin technology probably actively sabotages that, at the point which you encourage other countries to invest in those devices and allow for the detection of those things like mines and depth charges, denying them the ability to actually, engage meaningfully. We would identify that the power of larger invading nations is obviously asymmetric in this debate, and that only the richest nations probably have the capacity to engage in strong dolphin and walrus programs, whereas smaller nations who seek to defend themselves using currently existing technologies do not. The final observation we would make here, though, is that empirically it is just untrue that the US military has historically used these for particularly just causes, but rather uses them to do things like clear out waterways so they can maintain ship embargoes, which is the mechanism behind how they engage in particularly perverse actions in South America. Like how they would do this, insofar as it, is a somewhat contributing factor to the success of those pernicious operations. We would suggest that is, in fact, something which is particularly immoral. These dolphins were incredibly intelligent and had fully fledged lived experiences. They were not worth sacrificing for a relatively small gain. So proud to affirm.
Awesome, thank you so much for that speech, and to conclude, I welcome third negative.
By making this debate about sea mines, something I actually kind of forgot about in prep, this team has actually just ended their own chances of winning this debate. Because we would tell you that the demining programs that Western countries, particularly the US, engage in areas like the Pacific, which are heavily mined from the after effects of World War I and II, in areas around Turkey, in areas around South America, in particular around the Falklands, there are quite large numbers of unexploded ordnances from previous conflicts that do threaten ordinary fishermen because people don't know where the mines are and fishing ships don't have the technology to equip them. This is probably the only unambiguously good thing that the US and other Western countries engage in as part of a series of international obligations that they hold to make up for these conflicts. These demining programs, like the demining programs that exist in countries like Rwanda, where they use other small animals, particularly rats often, to find mines that are just buried below the dirt. Same is true of the mines that are buried in the ocean. These are things that seriously threaten innocent people, that seriously threaten often people living in relatively impoverished areas who do not have alternatives like just taking another route, because they literally do not know where the mines are. This is a fantastically good program. We would happily trade off 100 sea lions if it meant that we were able to protect several ships, or even honestly a singular ship of somebody like the Solomon Islands fishermen, somebody fishing around the Falkland Islands. So let's firstly talk about morality, then we'll talk about military uses and alternatives, and then we'll talk about outcomes for the animal and other animals as well. The first thing to say here is that in order to believe that this is indeed an immoral program, at the end of this debate, you should believe that the program should be ended. You should believe that it is on net harmful. And that is the thing that this team stumbles upon. Because they do point out correctly that many people feel that eating meat has moral problems, like people recognize that there are things that are wrong with it, but obviously when people continue to choose to do it, they do make the decision that on net it is not immoral. Some people would probably say that it is amoral, some people would say that it is in fact morally fine, but obviously people don't regularly engage in things that they would declare themselves to be immoral, and the claim that we make is that this is a far clearer case and much easier for you to judge, because the risks are extremely low. And note again, just how much of this team's case hinges on the idea that mines are triggered by dolphins swimming near them. A clearly ludicrous claim. Mines usually detect magnetism. We tell you that in Gypsy speech. And you should believe that that is true. Because why on earth? Like, there are so many fish in the sea. Not to make a, but there are many fish in the sea. There are many whales in the sea, which are much larger than dolphins. There are many other things about, like fishing vessels that are small, which is why usually mines are designed specifically to target magnetism and to target a significant amount of it before they explode. Because mines are very expensive. The obvious intuition here is that no country would waste, often we are talking about millions of dollars per depth charge or per mine, on like, oh no, what if a dolphin swims past it? And that would often trigger an entire field of mines. So you wouldn't just lose one mine, you would lose like 100 in the instance where a single dolphin swims through, which is why this is such a comical claim from them, an empirically untrue one, but also a completely asserted one anyway. You should believe the reasons that we give you, that obviously it doesn't work like that. And if you believe that, then you should believe that there are very few risks for these dolphins, that they can swim right up to the mine, that they can bounce it around as though it were a ball, and it would not in fact explode, because it is designed to detect something like, a warship, not like a blue whale, or even like a very puny dolphin. Like, this is a completely safe program. You should believe that this is far more like drug detection dogs. Like, it's even safer than something like a rat running across a minefield in Rwanda. The second thing to talk about, though, is that when you think about military uses, like, this is extremely useful, because the alternatives do not work. Like, mines are specifically designed not to be detectable by ships, which is why things like existing sonar or magnar systems are not enough to find these mines, and you do actually need to rely upon the animals. Like, if you did not have these animals, it would be very hard to justify the expense of demining. The last thing that this team provides you is kind of this idea that dolphins are in fact diffusing the mines. Maybe it's just, no, they're not. They're detecting them, they pop up, and then a boat comes and finds the mine. Very obvious, but also explains why this isn't being used in offensive situations. It's being used in the pacifist situations we describe. Because obviously, maybe a dolphin could swim into the Taiwanese Strait and detect many mines, one of the most heavily mined areas in the world. But an American ship could not then enter the Taiwanese Strait and start, hauling up the mines and demining them. Like, because they would get shot down by the Chinese, it would be a huge international incident. Obviously impossible and implausible, which is why this is a program that is really only useful in its defensive capacity for finding those unexploded ordnances from past conflicts, hauling them up out of the water. And obviously that just makes far more sense. You would not you would not risk causing an international incident by accidentally blowing up the whole Taiwanese Strait. You would do this when countries literally invited you in to engage in this program around their waters, something the US military does have an incentive to do, to build ties in the Pacific, an area that they're increasingly pivoting to. Which is why this is really clearly a very good idea that is used in very good ways, not the kind of thing that this team describes. Like, you would not be able to proactively send the dolphins in to demine an area around South America in order to trade blockade it. One, most of the South American states do not have the money to mine those areas in the first place. Like, it's unclear that they're even doing that. But two, obviously you would be detected and it would cause a massive incident at the point where you're sending the follow-up ship in. Like, the dolphin is not capable of putting a mine in its mouth. Like, think about how biology works and how large mines are and how small dolphin mouths are. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you'd have to send in a boat. The last thing to talk about then is just what the alternatives are. This team suggests that this takes away from doing things like building better bomb detection methods. Like, I don't know, guys, you want to give heaps of money to Raytheon or Base Systems or Boeing to develop those systems for you, I guess? It's just a far more unethical thing. Something which, by the way, we do point out in Tetsushi's speech to no response, that obviously it's better to spend the money on salmon for sea lions than it is to spend many millions, if not billions of dollars on detection programs that are run by members of the military-industrial complex who will use this money to do things like lobby for more conflicts or build more evil mines that cannot even be detected by dolphins. Like, I don't know, like it seems like a far worse alternative. They just kind of assert that it could be a good thing. They never actually prove it. We suggest that this is used in extremely bad ways. So, at the end of all of this, we save literally millions of lives, make it possible to fish in areas, we allow people to sustain themselves, to live safely, to have more effective shipping routes, all of which makes it far easier to live in these areas in the Pacific, far better for those people who are highly disadvantaged. Let's weigh that off then against stuff to do with animals. First thing is that they suggest that these animals are exposed to risk on our sides. We destroy them on the mine's point because it didn't make any sense. But the second thing is that they suggest that perhaps this will cause a reaction in which other powers will seek to rid the world of the scourge of dolphins or sea lions, because one of them could be an American agent. The first thing to say here is that this seems like a very expensive program for a relatively low risk, given the characterization that we both seem to agree on how these animals are being used. That seems quite implausible. The second thing to say is that military ships do not have like large trolling nets on them that they could use to efficiently rid the world of dolphins. Like, they're military ships, they're meant for efficiency. They don't have huge nets, they only have missiles. Those missiles cost millions of dollars, and maybe one missile could take out like 2 dolphins if you get the aim really correct. Cost benefit here just makes no sense. The second thing is that they suggest that you would strap bombs to them. I think we defeat this pretty clearly in Gypsy's speech. Like, pretty absurd. Also, like, are there stationary naval bombs that you could duct tape to a dolphin? Like, does that product even exist? What would you use it for? Like, I don't know. It's just, like, you probably just use missiles. The third thing and the most compelling thing that they give us is about separation. I'll jump straight to what I think the most easy intuition pump here is, which is that I think that you can analogize a dolphin to probably like a 7-year-old kid, maybe even a 10-year-old kid if we're being really generous, or if the dolphin is particularly bright. But we accept things like parents moving schools with that child. We accept things like them moving countries with that child. That separates that kid from their friends. It separates that kid in many instances from their families. And yet we recognize the right of the parent to make the correct decision for the child. That's something society accepts all the time, sees as completely permissible. We obviously recognize that that 10-year-old probably can't consent. But we accept it's fine, because it's often in the best interest, and we trust that the parents know what is right. Similarly here, you should trust that the US Navy knows what is right. You should trust that they're giving these animals particularly high-quality seafood, that they're treating them probably pretty well, and that they're in relatively good forms of enclosures. The last thing to say is that, compare it to like the life in the wild, nasty, British, and short, and filled with mines. On our side, we use these animals for a higher purpose, and we help people fundamentally good.
Great, thanks everyone so much for that debate. Cross the floor, shake hands, and we'll come and get you shortly. Okay, timing wise, I think we're going to just launch straight in, and I'm assuming panels will be back soon. Okay, so first of all, I think on net, this was a quite good debate. I think it was very entertaining. I think all speakers did a relatively good job. In saying that, 3 pieces of general feedback, then I'll tell you who won, and then I'll examine why. First piece of general feedback is, I think, in a debate where there are lots of nuances and intricacies in what this policy and model actually involves, I think it would be helpful if both teams had stepped that out clearer from the start. I don't think the info slide gives a huge amount away, but I think both teams had a relatively good understanding of what this thing looked like. I think the problem was it came out in responsive rather than in setup. So I think on the side of more setup in a debate such as this. The second thing is, make sure you push your responses, your kind of silver bullet responses, to your earliest speakers. So I think there is a lot of good engagement and good response that came out at the end of cases rather than at the start. So I think that's just like a team sharing thing. Just make sure that your responses are consistent down the bench and that your best stuff comes out as soon as possible. The last thing is, make sure that your prioritization is correct. So, for example, as jovial as it was, like the suicide bombing stuff is obviously silly. So I think just sack it from the start, like rather than responding to it kind of with a blunt knife, just by way of being efficient. So we unanimously gave this debate to the negative team, and I'm going to explain that now. First issue is going to be on animal rights with 4 claims. The second issue is on humans and are they better placed? And the final one is on what are the alternatives to this by way of research. Firstly, on animal rights, 4 claims that we hear from the affirmative from the start. The first one is around the training stage, and they explain to us that the kind of training that these animals are made to undergo is incredibly immoral, it's incredibly dangerous, and they analogize it to things like working at SeaWorld. Negative's response here is to say that, first of all, there's an incentive for these animals, particularly these dolphins, to be treated well. And that's because Places like the Navy don't have a profit incentive like SeaWorld does to cut corners, so the chances of them being kind of, malnourished and treated in a way that's abusive is relatively low. Second of all, that the Navy doesn't want the reputation of being dolphin killers. But thirdly, that the Navy is a relatively good military institution compared to others. So if one institution is going to be in charge of these animals, let it be the Navy, because they're probably the best one. The second claim from Affirmative on this issue is that we make these animals go against their natural instinct. And I think this is relatively well explained at first. They tell us things like tracking bombs and tracking mines is not something these animals are genetically disposed to do, so making them do it in of itself is immoral, but it is also dangerous. Negative's response here is to say that it's unclear why training against these specific natural instincts are bad in the instances where the danger of these things manifesting is so low. So the way we would say, I think the kids not wanting to read is an odd example, but that's the example we hear. Kids don't want to read, but we force them to do that. I think the better example is in the same way that dogs aren't trained to look for drugs, that's still something that we believe is morally permissible at the point where the benefits of it are so high. The third thing that Affirmative says is that these animals are taught to do things like swim towards danger. And the problem with this is it's immoral because they can do things like accidentally set off mines. I am by no means an expert, but I think that Negative explains, and I'm just going to buy into it and believe it, that the way that these mines operate are such that this won't happen. But I think this is mechanized quite well, because they explain that if these mines were to go off when dolphins would just swim by them, that would be silly because there's so many other fish in the sea, and if they went off every time, you'd have an explosion every other day, right? So probably it's silly. Then more do things like target magnetism, for example. So it's just not worth the cost to Navy institutions for that to happen. Second of all, they tell us that it's similar to guide dogs and drug dogs, and that's a particularly acceptable way of using animals because the kind of things they're actually trained to do are do things like swim in the sea, retrieve something or find something, and then come back to the port, rather than actually taking the mines out themselves, which is not something they are biologically capable of doing, but also something that they are just would never kind of practically be able to do. The other thing they tell us is that this is far less kind of immoral than other things that we permit to be moral. And the example we hear here is eating meat. So it's at the point where we think that eating animals is morally permissible, it is probably also morally permissible to teach them to do things like retrieve things and identify things in the water. Affirmative's response here is to say, first of all, the average person probably doesn't think eating meat is okay, which I think is poorly explained at second, but well explained at third, when we hear that even if people think that eating meat is okay, they still think there is a level of immorality to it. So perhaps they question their decisions when they're doing that. Negative's response here is to say that obviously it's not true that most people think eating meat is immoral, but even if people recognize that there are moral issues with eating meat, on net they make the decision that it is worth it because it is something that sustains them and something they enjoy doing and something that is helpful to them. So even if there are moral questions about it, this debate is about is the morality on net good or on net bad, and I think Negative proves in this third thing that probably on net it is moral to be able to do this. The last thing Affirmative tells us is that the problem with this training is it means that animals can no longer live in the wild by virtue of the fact that they're being trained against their instincts. Negative's first response is that we're literally putting them in a habitat where they would be anyway by virtue of the fact that your training occurs in the ocean. But second of all, that the wild is actually more brutal because there's things like predators and climate change and nets catching them, and that's probably more dangerous for them than being in a training facility, even if it is slightly more enclosed. Affirmative says that this type of treatment is particularly bad because you're forced to do things like breed and give birth. I think this is not the most strategic response from Affirmative, just because I think it's quite easy for Negative to then say that, well, we breed animals for things that are far less useful, like having pet cavoodles or whatever. So that's probably something that we should be allowed to do. But also, it's better for these animals to live than not live at all. And if breeding more of them means more of them get to do things like play in the ocean and catch balls, that's probably on net a benefit. Finally, what do we hear from Affirmative by way of response? And I think this is where their best material had come out. I wish it had come out earlier, but by no means did I not credit it. And that's, first of all, that these animals aren't an endangered species. So the characterization from Negative that they get things like food and protection is probably not that important because that probably exists for them in the status quo anyway. Second of all, that the process of hunting is an enjoyable experience and actually something that stimulates their mind, and that's probably on net something we would benefit. But that what this perhaps creates is that because one other country is going to start copycatting this behavior, they'll do things like shoot down a whole bunch of dolphins because they're worried that they're military invaders, they're worried that they have technology inside of them, and that means that we're actually going to lose a huge amount of animals because countries are going to go into self-protection mode and kill them. Negative's response here, though, that I think kind of finally gets over is that the way in which these activities are done is in a non-threatening sense because it's mainly defensive. But second of all, like, countries just don't have incentives to kill all of the dolphins that are in the vicinity of their kind of shores because it's incredibly expensive but also incredibly silly, and also just gives them a bad reputation if that is like to all the dolphins, right? So I think at the end of that, first of all, I believe that these animals, even if they're not treated perfectly, they are treated relatively well and probably are better off than they are in the wild, because even if they get less daily stimulation, they still get things like access to food resources, particularly in a time of climate change. That's probably a benefit. Secondly, I believe that the kind of work they're doing is relatively passive, relatively low level, and probably doesn't pose to them a huge amount of danger. But finally, I believe that it is analogous to things like sniffer dogs, which on net benefit people, which goes into the second issue. So that first issue, I think, pretty conclusively falls to the negative team. The second question is, are humans actually better placed to do this kind of activity? An affirmative tells us that humans are better to do it because they can consent to the dangers, and animals do have things like a conscience and feelings. Negative's first response is to say that humans have a higher level of intelligence, and even if animals have some, humans have more. That's because they grieve more, they're more smart, there's more ramifications when they die, but also humans don't consent to, for example, being blown up by a mine when they go out into the waters. Whilst I think third affirmative gives good characterization around why dolphins are intelligent and have community bonds, I think that negative's weighing, which says that even if some of these dolphins or sea lions get killed, that is okay because the amount of human lives we are able to save is actually worth it. And they explain to us that the kind of human lives we're saving are particularly vulnerable people often who don't know where these mine paths are. So when affirmative suggests they can do things like find other routes to protect themselves, I don't believe that's an option because I think in the instances where you use these mining dolphins, that's actually to protect the most vulnerable people like fishermen, for example, who don't know where these mines have actually been harvested many, many years ago. So on net, the amount of human lives you're able to save is probably worth it. But also, the level of defensive work they do generally is just so high that it probably makes it worth it. So at the end of that issue, I think that humans' lives should be weighed higher by way of finding these mines and the danger involved in that. But second of all, the volume of humans you're able to spare by using these dolphins, even if some of them get killed or harmed in the process, is probably worth it. So I think on scale balance, that falls to negative. Finally, on researching other ways, and this is a very small issue, but basically I just want to credit what affirmative says, because I think it is true when they say that now there is less reason and incentive to research into other alternatives for doing things like demining, and this military money, it's incredibly expensive and it's better to redistribute it. I think negative points out here that one, this is comparatively a cheap way to invest this money. You're able to get a lot of dolphins for a small cost. But second of all, that likely these other alternatives involve doing things like funding the military industrial complex, which has had huge historical negative ramifications. They're pretty greedy. They kind of are pro-war, and that's probably on net a bad thing. So even if it is expensive to do the dolphins, which I don't believe it is, but even if it is, I think the other options are probably morally worse and something that we ought to oppose. So that's why I think the debate won to the negative. Both of us had extremely similar thoughts, so approach either of us for feedback, but good job. Cool.